Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to welcome you to Senate Judiciary. This afternoon, we're going to start the public hearings with opening the public hearing on House Bill 107 and recognize prime sponsor, Representative Verville. Welcome to Senate Judiciary. We apologize, we're a few minutes behind our time.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you, members of the committee. Sorry about that. I should have known better. Thank you, Madam Chair, and members of the committee. I've just got a little handout packet that's making its way around, and it sort of explains the impetus for the bill. So, House Bill 107, relative to employment restrictions for registered sex offenders, is a bill to close a loophole in our existing law. And the packet that you have has some news stories in it that highlight where the unintended loophole in the law has been exploited. So, in a nutshell, the change to this RSA spells it out more clearly. That registered sex offenders shall not hire, manage, supervise, or work one-on-one with minor children in the state of New Hampshire. That was the original intent of the law. You know, where legislators were not perfect, the courts said the law says what it says, not what you want it to say. So this closes that loophole. This bill protects both sides. This bill protects registered sex offenders as well as minor children in New Hampshire. I think how it protects minor children in New Hampshire is fairly obvious, so we'll put that to the back burner. How it protects registered sex offenders is that sex offenses have, if not the highest recidivism rate of any crime, it is one of the highest. And this bill simply prevents registered sex offenders from being placed into a position where they're likely to offend again. These people have committed a crime, they've been convicted, they've served their time, now they're out. But we still want to make sure that they don't offend again, and in that exercise, we want to protect children. So that's what this bill does. This bill has come before this committee a couple of times. It got gobbled up in omnibus bills back in COVID days, and my colleague behind me, the representative, had some issues the last time around. We brought it around. We've worked together as a committee and with the representative to make sure that everybody's concerns have been addressed. And I believe that that's what this bill is. So we had a subcommittee on the House side. We put in a lot of work, a lot of effort to make language that is appropriate for all parties. It was passed by the committee 20 to nothing, brought to the floor of the House, and it passed on consent. So I think we have a very, very good bill. One of the major concerns that we heard when we began this is that we can't make the law so narrowly focused that registered sex offenders cannot find employment. And I agree 100%. Right? We need people to be productive members of society, and we need to make sure those opportunities exist. This bill, as you have it, does that. So it doesn't prevent somebody from working in an environment where minor children may be working or even customers. What it does prevent is it prevents them from being direct supervisors, direct managers, or to be working one-on-one, because those are supervising and managing is a position of power, and to have a registered sex offender in a position of power over a minor child is obviously a very dangerous situation, at least in my opinion. I would hope that you would concur with that. And it prevents them from being assigned to work one-on-one, so they're not alone off somewhere where there aren't others around to make sure everything is good. So that is the bill as you have it. I would be more than happy to take any questions any member of the committee would have.
Thank you very much for your testimony, Representative. Are there any questions from the committee? I have a quick question. I'm looking at the effective date, with the effective date being of January 1st, 2024. Is there a particular reason why you've had this taking effect next year as opposed to this year?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. That's an excellent question. And that was done on the advice of people with more experience in these types of matters. And basically, it's to allow the word to get out of the change in the law, so that everybody knows what the new rule is, so that nobody's caught flat-footed, so to speak, right? You don't want something to take effect very quickly and people don't find out and find themselves acting in an illegal manner through really no fault of their own. If the Senate wants to move that date closer, I certainly would have no objection to that at all. But that's where that date comes from.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions? Seeing none.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
if I might apologize, I'm sorry. And I really didn't introduce myself. My name is Kevin Verville, and I represent Rockingham 2, which is Auburn, Candia, and Deerfield. Just for the record, I apologize. I didn't properly introduce myself at the beginning.
Okay. Thank you, Representative.
Thank you.
The chair will call Representative Terry Roy. Oh, you don't want to speak. I'm sorry. Okay, Representative Lynn. Good afternoon, Representative.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. My name is Bob Lynn. I'm a representative from Wyndham. And I'll be very brief. As the chair may remember, last year, there was a bill that was somewhat similar to this and that I testified here against because I thought my concern was that it was worded so broadly that, as Representative Verville pointed out, and I think it was not in anyone's interest, it would have, I think it was worded so broadly that it would have prevented someone that was a registered sex offender from, for example, getting a job working at the checkout as a checkout person at Market Basket or something like that. And it just seemed to me that, if you're talking about somebody that's a registered sex offender, it's not likely they're going to be getting a job in the boardroom of BAE Systems. These are the kind of jobs that are much more likely. And if you have a prohibition that's so broad that they can't really get any work, that's not in their interest. It's not in our interest either. I mean, that basically is a prescription for either they're committing some further crimes, sex offenders or otherwise, or ending up on welfare that we're all paying for. So that was the basis of my opposition last year. But I do think Representative Verville and I worked with him on this, and then the committee also did a good deal of work on this. And I think that the language that is here now avoids that problem. It does focus in narrowly on the circumstances where somebody shouldn't be working, either direct supervision of minors or one-on-one relationship with minors, that kind of thing. Because of the changes that have been made, I think it's a good bill. Language is. You can never capture every possible situation. And is there some circumstance where all of us might say, well, the bill could have been tweaked a little bit more, possibly. But I really do think this is a very good effort, and I think it is fair to both sex offenders and to children who need protection. So I strongly support it, and I'm happy to answer any questions that.
Thank you very much, Representative, for your testimony. Are there any questions from the committee? Okay, seeing none.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any other member of the public who would like to speak to House Bill 107? Okay, seeing none, we're going to close the public hearing. Thank you, Gabrielle. Okay, you ready, Matthew? Okay. We're going to open the public hearing on House Bill 400 and recognize the prime sponsor, Representative Roy. Good afternoon, Representative.
Good afternoon, Madam Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Representative Terry Roy, Rockingham 32, representing the towns of Auburn, Chester, Deerfield, and Candia. I bring before you today House Bill 400. House Bill 400 is a bill. Well, let me start by saying this. New Hampshire is the only state in the United States of America that does not have a charge for assault and battery on a police officer. The only state. In New Hampshire, if you decide to strike a police officer, or as per this bill, a firefighter or EMT, or anyone doing their job for us, it is the same as two fellows getting in a fight in a bar. There's no difference in the law. Currently, law enforcement officers, as we know across the country, are being assaulted and killed at greater rates than ever before in history. It is one of the most dangerous times to be a law enforcement officer right now. This bill what it does is it takes the charges that are currently available for regular, normal citizens and goes to the next level up in penalties. So it doesn't automatically make it a much more horrific crime. It just makes it one step up. So in other words, a simple assault on a person and a simple assault on a police officer or a firefighter EMT in the course of their duties would be considered the same penalty as a simple assault with bodily injury. I just moved it up one level for each one. The next thing the bill does is it also allows police officers to create a safe distance. Studies have shown that it's almost impossible for a police officer to draw his firearm to defend himself against a knife attack with someone in less than 30 feet of them. And as we have all seen on television currently, during protests and uprisings of this nature, one of the things people like to do is get right in the face of a police officer and try to provoke them for violence. It's almost impossible to defend yourself in that position. What this would allow a police officer to do is say you need to back up, stay at that distance, and if someone refuses and continues to get in their face, they can be arrested, and that would be a misdemeanor. Finally, what this does is it would make it a Class A misdemeanor for someone to make a false report against a law enforcement officer or other EMT worker based on false information that they knowingly know is false. Right now, it's very difficult to get people to apply for these jobs and to fill these positions. And more than ever, we are looking at them under a microscope to ensure that they are not violating the civil rights of our citizens. We are holding them to a very high standard, and justly so. But as a part of that, we should also offer them some modicum of protection against false allegations. A police officer who gets a false allegation, right away they're off the job. There's a potential to be put on this Lori list and ruin their careers. This gives them some protection that if someone knowingly, and it's proven that they knew it was false, they could be charged for making such an allegation. And it's not just police officers, it's firefighters and EMTs. Finally, I would, if you would indulge me, I have spoken with Senator Abbas, and there's an amendment being brought forth to this. As you may or may not know, a week ago, a member of the House, Representative Adjutant Josh, he works as a security officer at a hospital. He was assaulted while on the job and severely injured. He was kicked in the head, may have had a brain aneurysm. He was forced to resign his position in the House because he can no longer perform that duty. And we discussed it, and we came to the conclusion that hospital security employees are just as deserving as this of this protection for this elevated assault as EMTs and firefighters. In his particular case, the police arrested someone for trespassing. The person had a history of violence on their record. They complained of chest pain. The police brought them to the emergency room and left them, just left. Now the hospital staff has to deal with this person. During the 4 to 5 hours they were there, they continually escalated and got more and more violent until an assault actually happened. And as we know, unfortunately for Representative Adjutant, he was the victim of that assault. Oftentimes this happens. Violent offenders are brought to the hospital. And if you're in an emergency room and you get brought in on a cart because you were just in an accident and someone has to do surgery to stop the bleeding, it's impossible to do that while someone in the next room is assaulting the hospital staff. So disrupting a hospital like that by assaulting hospital security staff, in my mind, in the minds of others, is just as important or just as bad as assaulting a firefighter or police officer in the course of their duties. So that would be the amendment that Senator Abbas would be bringing forward that we discussed. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony, Representative. Are there any questions from the committee? Senator Whitley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks for taking my question, Representative Roy. So you may be well aware that the Senate has been grappling with the latter issue that you mentioned about, violence in our hospitals and things like that. And, one of the interests that we are balancing is making sure that we're not further criminalizing individuals who struggle with mental health. And so that's something that immediately pops up in my mind, particularly when we're talking about EMS here, is that we know, and I know in Concord, the vast majority of the calls that police are called to involve someone with a significant mental illness. And so we do not want to further criminalize mental illness. I think we're all in agreement of that. And so I'm wondering if the House considered that in contemplating this bill.
Well, actually, no, they didn't, because the amendment is being brought now, so it never came to the House. It would originate here. So with regard to that, I totally agree. I recently took my committee on a tour of the courts. And as part of that, we heard testimony, well, not testimony, but we heard information from the courts about the success of the drug courts. And we intend to work with them to expand the mental health courts. So the mental health aspect is very, very important. And I would suggest that any criminal charge, one element is culpability. And if someone is mentally ill, they're obviously not culpable for the charges that they do. And a judge would make that determination. But part of the amendment is going to mandate that a police officer stay with an arrestee. There's no excuse in my mind for a police department dropping off a criminal who's under arrest, not been bailed, just leaving them with the hospital staff. So that would be part of that amendment as well. And the police are obviously trained in mental health and what they should be doing with them. So I would suggest that I would be open to any amendments necessary to ensure that it doesn't capture mental health patients.
Senator Chandler.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Representative. Listening to your testimony in favor of this bill, I can't agree with you more that certainly police officers, folks in law enforcement, sometimes firefighters, anyone responding to an emergency situation is often in extreme danger. But I do have a question about whether the right way to address that is by increasing the assault charge, because I'm wondering if that the act of assault against anyone is awful. And I'm just trying to weigh the benefit of changing that part of our statutes to, what's the advantage there? I can see if a person is interfering with a member of law enforcement in his or her work, in that person's work, that's a different charge. But a person who assaults a member of law enforcement, is that really worse? Is it a worse thing for that person to do? Not about the victim, but is it worse for a person to assault anyone? Can you understand my question?
That's an excellent question, and we actually debated that in the House. And, is one person any more important than another person is what it comes down to. And it's not about the person. It's not about the police officer. What we came to the conclusion of is an assault on a police officer or an EMT or a firefighter is an assault on all of us. They represent our system of law. They represent us, the Senate and the House. We make a law, and we say, now you enforce that law. And we need to ingrain in our society that This system of law is what keeps us acting civilized. And when someone makes an assault, in other words, if two folks get in a fight in a bar, it's not the same as when someone says, I have no respect for your system of laws in your society, and I'm going to assault it violently. Because if the police, what's next? They're really all that stands between us and that violence and protecting us from that assault. So it's not the fact that they are a police officer or a firefighter and they're more worthy of protection. It's that our society itself is more worthy of protection, because an assault on them is indeed an assault on our system of law, versus an assault on me is just an assault on Representative Roy. So there's a difference. It's personalized when it's between two people, but when you assault the same as a judge or anyone else, and there's already, as a matter of fact, representatives and senators already have a more serious crime if you assault one of us. Why would we not extend that to the law enforcement and our service providers? Thank you for the question.
Are there any further questions for this witness? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony,
Thank you,
Representative.
Senator.
The chair will call Jeffrey Odland.
Good afternoon,
Good
Madam
afternoon.
Chair, members of the committee. My name is Jeffrey Odland. I've testified before you in the past. I'm a resident of Amherst, New Hampshire, but I'm here in my capacity as the president of the New Hampshire Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, testifying in opposition to this bill. I'd like to speak briefly in response to some of the points made by Representative Roy, and then focus in on a part of the bill that really wasn't touched on much previously, which is frankly probably my association's largest concern. One point I wanted to make for the senators for you to consider is that I think Representative Roy stated that as the law stands right now, if a law enforcement officer is assaulted in the state of New Hampshire, it's the same as someone being assaulted in a bar fight. That's actually not quite accurate. There is a provision under the New Hampshire Criminal Code for extended terms of incarceration based on certain aggravating factors. And one of those aggravating factors is that the offense occurred to a law enforcement officer while discharging their lawful duties. So I would point the senators to RSA 651-6H. And in my experience as a practitioner in the criminal courts, I can tell you that individuals are frequently charged with extended term simple assault for having assaulted a law enforcement officer. Just so you're clear, it does operate a bit differently than the way this bill would. This bill, as I understand it, would increase the general provision. It would take what would otherwise be a misdemeanor and make it a Class B felony. The extended term provision maintains the misdemeanor character of the allegation, but it has a possible punishment of up to 5 years in the New Hampshire State Prison instead of the normal 12 months. Further on that point, I would say that the association, I think, picking up on the line of questioning from Senator Chandley, the association takes the position that it's not good public policy to give a privileged status to particular classes of victims. But with that in mind, I would urge the senators to, if you are considering passing the bill, to consider amending it to make it an amendment to the extended term provision rather than to create a new class of crimes that are Class B felonies. With those thoughts, I'd like to turn your attention to the amendments that are in this bill with respect to the false reports to law enforcement provisions. And my association has serious concerns that this will have a significant chilling effect on both citizens as well as fellow law enforcement officers reporting police misconduct should it occur. I would point out to the senators that it is an unfortunate truth that there have been highly publicized instances of police misconduct in our state, within the last 10 years. I certainly don't think it's indicative of the general character of law enforcement in the state of New Hampshire, but there have been serious issues that have come forth in the press and through lawsuits. Officer Aaron Brown was an officer employed by Manchester Police for many years who was fired for making racist comments through text with respect to his work. Trooper Hayden Wilbur was fired recently by the New Hampshire State Police after having conducted an illegal search of a detainee and lying about that search once it came to light and was placed under investigation. There was Officer Kibbe of the Claremont PD who was found to have lied in an affidavit that he submitted under oath to the court in support of an arrest warrant where he claimed to have seen a suspect in possession of weapons that he claimed were in plain view, but were in fact not in plain view. And I bring that up just to say that government misconduct and law enforcement misconduct is serious when it does occur. And these provisions create a special carve-out that, in essence, will result in any allegation of police misconduct potentially turning into a misdemeanor if it's later investigated and deemed to have been false. I would point you, senators, to the way that these issues come to light frequently, which is through the filing of lawsuits under Section 1983 of the Federal Code, 42 U.S.C. 1983, alleging a purposeful violation of someone's constitutional rights. The way I read Roman 3 under the false report statute as proposed in the bill, if someone filed an action which came to the attention of a law enforcement agency claiming that an officer violated their constitutional rights, in other words, engaged in misconduct by violating their rights, and they were to have a jury trial on that issue and lose, they could potentially be committing a misdemeanor under the language of this bill. I think that's highly problematic because I think it would clearly influence people to simply not preserve their legal rights and to be wary of bringing any sort of concerns about police misconduct forward in a capacity of an internal affairs type investigation, trying to file a police report for a criminal investigation, or even bringing a simple lawsuit. And some of these questions are quite difficult. I can say as a brief anecdote, I remember in law school I worked on a case, it was not a New Hampshire case, of an individual who was being drunk and disorderly. And in the process of being taken into arrest, he was handcuffed behind the back. Both of his wrists were broken, okay? And I actually don't know what happened with that case. Maybe the officer, maybe he was so unruly, the officer was justified in using a lot of force. And maybe it was excessive force. But my concern about the reading of this bill is that if a jury decided, you've accused this officer of using excessive force, but that's false. We think it was sustained under these circumstances. As of today, that person simply wouldn't recover money damages. But if this bill goes into law, they can now find themselves on the end of a misdemeanor charge where they're looking at going to the House of Corrections for up to a year. And I think that's very concerning with respect to New Hampshire's citizens' ability to hold the government to account and to simply have these issues investigated. Finally, I would point out that Representative Roy said that the environment for law enforcement is difficult. They're under the public eye more than perhaps ever before. And I don't necessarily disagree with that, senators, but I would say that the vehicle for officers that are wrongfully alleged to have violated the law are already in our laws. So first of all, an individual could be charged under the now existing false report to law enforcement statute if they file and try and have a police officer charged with a crime that did not in fact occur. That's under the current law. And additionally, those officers could avail themselves of the civil courts for defamation of character if they were slandered or defamed by an individual claiming that they acted improperly when they in fact didn't. And so that was the end of my comments. I'd be happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you very much for your testimony, Mr. Odlin. Are there any questions from the committee? Senator Abbas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for taking my question. I think you might have just answered this, but I just wanted to clarify. On page 2, Roman numeral 2, that's lines 12 to 15. My reading of that would be that that would fall under what is existing law, Roman numeral 1, section A. With the only difference is the misdemeanor language versus Class A misdemeanor.
I think that's correct, Senator. And just to clarify, I think what you were referencing to, because I made reference to that phrase inartfully, I think, because I didn't point to the bill. But my basic testimony would be that on line 14, where it refers to criminal misconduct and sort of Roman 2 as a whole, that would already be captured in the existing law. It's sort of redundant of the existing law. And then the concerns that I was testifying to, Senator, a moment ago are more when we move down to line 18, it removes the language about the misconduct having been criminal. It just simply uses the word misconduct generally. So, for example, excessive force, even if it didn't rise to the level of a crime, if that a claim of excessive force was later deemed unfounded, I think there'd be potential jeopardy for that person.
Okay, are there any further questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony.
Thank you.
The chair will call Aubrey Freeman. Good afternoon, Mr. Freeman.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, committee members. Aubrey Friedman, Bridgewater. I speak in opposition to this bill, and some of what the previous speaker said echoes my thoughts. Why have a special, it seems to me we're talking mostly about police officers here, and more so than the other two groups mentioned. And it is a tougher job, and they run into all kinds of problems. But having special protection seems to me should be handled more by the pay that you get and your benefits. It's a tougher job. You should get more pay and benefits. Don't create special, I mean, is a policeman's life worth more than any worker that they do? Or, you know, just the work you do shouldn't define, your life isn't worth any more or less either, of course, but by creating special classes, it creates this problem, as just was mentioned, just recently, the state rep who was a security guard, maybe we should add that to the list too. So, let's say even a McDonald's worker, they're doing their job, somebody gets crazy, they don't like their hamburger and they beat them up viciously. So is that person less deserving of special protection too? So that's the problem when you create these extra classes. It's everybody. If violence is unprovoked, then that crime should be what it is, and it should have nothing to do with the job that they do. They do a harder job, which clearly being a police officer is harder, more challenges, then give them more pay and benefits. And I think they're, you know, however you look at that, but it shouldn't be special laws, because the problem, you get more and more groups. Well, it's not fair. How come they get it? Is my life worth less? Is it worth less? That's the problem with that. And that's why you'd have to keep on adding more state reps. Somebody beats you up or whatever, you're doing your job. So that's the problem. I say the law should apply to everybody the same. It should have nothing to do with the work that you do. Everybody's life is worth the same. And just one other point about the false allegations, which was again brought up with the previous speaker. Why is it if you make false allegations against a police officer, usually we're talking police officers, it wouldn't be the other two categories, that's extra crime or extra punishment, or it's a worse crime. But what if the police officer, as does happen once in a while, they make false allegations against someone else? why does the police officer get that special one and not the other person? It works both ways. So those are the reasons I oppose this bill.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Are there any questions?
Thank you.
Seeing none,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
The chair will call Representative Horrigan. Good afternoon, Representative.
Thank you very much. So I'm resident Timothy Horrigan from the town of Stratford District 10, home of the Durham and UNH police departments, which are both excellent. I definitely don't consider myself an anti-police, a police rep, even though I'm a progressive Democrat. But I think this bill, there may be a few good things in here, but it goes much too far, and also it's probably generally unnecessary. The chairman of the Criminal Justice Committee said that there was an epidemic of violence against police officers, and he's probably right when he cited that percentage. With the number of police officers that gets killed in the line of duty is probably a lot. In fact, I was just looking it up today. It was smaller than I would have expected, but it's so the most recent year I found complete data for 73 officers were actually the victim of a homicide. Either they were shot or assaulted by another person. Plus, there's 56 who died accidentally in motor vehicle accidents and the like. So the other side of the ledger, consistently over 1,000 people every year for the past several years have been killed by the police officers. So they're actually killing a lot more civilians, and the civilians are killing them. So if you feel the need to write a bill like this, you might want to put in something there to just add more harshly punish police officers who murder a civilian, because there's probably a lot more of those incidents. We're not, the George Floyd incident 3 years ago attracted a lot of attention, but that was probably just because of the accident, the fact that it happened in a crowded place where there are a lot of civilians around with cameras, and they probably would have had it. And I think Officer Chauvin was actually, he's been in prison actually on federal charges, not state charges anyway. So there's probably a lot more incidents in that than we're led to believe. Even here in New Hampshire, a large percentage of the homicides, I guess until just the last year or two, the union leader would always publish a list early in January of every homicide in the state. And a little bit less than half, but usually about 40% or thereabouts were police officers, shooting civilians they're interacting with. Many times civilians had done something wrong and were resisting arrest, so it's not, it's perhaps not totally unforgivable, but that's and then nationwide, New Hampshire is a relatively peaceful state. Nationwide, still about 1 in 20 of all the homicides are committed by police officers, and homicide is just sort of all deliberate killings. It often isn't murder, in fact. So I think if you and then I think with the last section is probably unnecessary unless you want to add language making it a similar offense for a police officer to do certain unethical things. And also, Section 2, it turns you can commit simple assault now on an officer, even if you're not actually hitting him or slapping him around. And I think that's not a good idea, especially since in a lot of these tragic incidents, one of the things that happen is that you have multiple officers on the scene, and they'll be issuing contradictory orders that the civilian interacting with them can't figure out what he's supposed to do. The classic case was the killing. I think that was in New Orleans several weeks ago, where they're telling him they're restraining a motorist, but then telling him things he couldn't do because he was restrained. So and then. Easily a thing where one officer is telling you to back up, and it's a noisy, chaotic scene, and then maybe somebody else is telling him to go one place, and one officer is telling you another. Okay, you see a lot of things where it's just in the confusion, on top of everything else bad that can happen to you if you're witnessing a crime scene. Now you can be charged for simple assault, even if you were just simply not sure where it was you were supposed to go. So I wouldn't necessarily reject everything in this bill, but I think what came over goes way too far, and you certainly should not pass what the House sent over to you. So that's my testimony. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Representative. Are there any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you.
Oh, the other thing about the killings is, it's a fairly small number. As I said, it's about 71 last year, so there's a lot of statistical noise in there. It's like, a 10% increase is only about 7 officials. And I know certainly, ideally, it should be 0, but yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Representative. Are there any other members of the public that would like to speak to House Bill 400? Okay, seeing none, we'll close the public hearing. Thank you very much. Yes, Matthew? Going to open the public hearing on House Bill 588 and call the prime sponsor, Representative Harriet Gaithright. Good afternoon, Representative.
Good afternoon. The version of the, I am Representative Linda Harriet Gathright out of Nashua Hills, Borough 10, Ward 9. Thank you. The version of the bill that was in the rear is not the full bill, so I brought it up on my computer so I can address it there. This bill came out of one of former residents of DLC, and ACLU contacted me to bring this bill forward. We met with our commissioner of DLC for about 2.5 hours to see what we could work through to make this bill palatable to everyone. One of the main reasons was New Hampshire was the only state that had a 100% minimum on the books at this time. And if you remember, back in the 80s and 70s, when Tough on Crime came about, we were the only state that had the 100%. Most of the states have already done away with it, or they're at 75 or 65 or 50%. I believe that there's only 4 states left that have what we call truth in sentencing on their books. So our committee worked together. Originally, the bill asked for a 50% minimum to have the eligibility to go before the parole board. In working with bipartisan in the committee, we actually put it through at 65%. It actually went to the consent calendar. And do you guys have the original copy of the bill, or you have the, you know, okay. So you can see that guidelines were put in place. One of the things about this, when it talks about the person was sentenced to a minimum of less than 7.5 years, the person has no major A-level disciplinary violations, the person has not demonstrated a pattern of repeated disciplinary offenses that result in an upgrade in classification level, and the person has completed all court and Department of Corrections required programs and treatments, and the person has demonstrated good institutional behavior. And that piece was very important because they do have, DLC do have, I would say, other, I forget what it's called now, but you can work towards getting your minimum, getting out sooner. The difference is anybody can do those. And if you don't have children, you can't do some. If you're not married, you can't do some. This is totally different. This is directed at a behavior change, different from the ones that are in place currently today. Paragraph 9 shall not apply if the person received a sentence that prohibits him or her from being paroled. The person was convicted of a sexually violent offense as defined in RSA 135E:211. The person was convicted of committing a violent crime as defined in RSA 651:513 against a person under 18 years of age. Applicability. The provision of this act shall apply to any person incarcerated any person, that's the amendment. The amendment should say that states that it's not retroactive. That's the essence of it. And the act shall take effect January 1, 2024, I think it said. And at that, I can take questions if you wish, but I do know that there are other people here that know a lot more about this than I do, but I'm open.
Thank you very much for your testimony, Representative. Are there any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you very
Thank you.
much. The chair will call Representative Terry Roy.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I'm here on this bill as in my capacity as chair of the Criminal Justice Committee in the House, and I will not reiterate all that the sponsor said. I am simply here to show you that this bill does indeed have broad bipartisan support, and all the members of the House and the committee that voted for this bill believe that hope is a necessary factor in rehabilitation. And when you give an incarcerated person a hope of making themselves better and getting a chance to get out of their sentence a little bit earlier, they'll behave better and they will make themselves better citizens. So this was indeed bipartisan, and I stand with my friend Harry Gathright and Representative Gathright in passing this. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you very much for your testimony this afternoon. Are there any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you very much. Representative, could you do me a favor and move that chair over for the next speaker, please? So she can come in. The chair will call Speaker Sytek. Good afternoon, Madam Speaker.
Good afternoon, Madam Chairman and members of the committee. Good to see you again. My name is Donna Sytek. I'm here as a private citizen, but a former member of the parole board for 10 years. And I was around in the 80s when our sentencing policy changed, and we called it truth in sentencing, because we wanted to be very, transparency is a word that's come up more frequently. In the 80s, we didn't call it transparency, we called it truth. The sentence imposed by the judge is the sentence that was supposed to be served. In New Hampshire, we have indeterminate sentencing. You are sentenced to a minimum, you serve the minimum, and then you have the possibility of being released on parole until your maximum. I'm opposed to this bill because it violates the tenets of truth in sentencing. I think the public deserves to know the actual sentence that's being served. I think truth in sentencing has served New Hampshire well. There are those who say, well, it's a policy from the 80s and it should be repealed. Well, we have a lot of policies that are worth preserving. Our first in the nation primary, our no sales or income tax. These are all policies that have stood the test of time, and I believe that truth in sentencing should join them. This bill would allow someone who has served a minimum, whose minimum sentence is not less than 7.5 years, to apply for consideration for parole. Now, what kind of crime would they have committed to get a minimum of 7.5 years? It has to be pretty serious crimes. I mean, it would be like second-degree murder, manslaughter, negligent homicide, first-degree assault, strangling, kidnapping, human trafficking, and robbery, as long as the victim was over 18. So right away, you've got a problem. We've got two categories of prisoners in the prison. I don't know how you keep track of them. Okay, your victim was under 18, your victim was over 18. And what do you do for the financial crimes that you might get a longer sentence for? How old were the victims for that? drug enterprise leaders. All of these are crimes that would be eligible if the victim was over 18, eligible for an early parole hearing. I think that's very confusing. The idea is to encourage people to change their behavior and show that they are eligible to serve a shorter time than the judge had originally sentenced them to. But I'd point out that existing provisions of the law already allow for sentence reduction for all crimes, not just the ones on the list here. Because the law recognizes that people can change. And so under the current law, 65120 allows an inmate to ask the court for a reduction of their minimum after they've served 2/3 of their minimum sentence. So for any crime, you can go back to the court and ask for a reduction after you've served 2/3 of the sentence. Often, in a drug offense, as part of the original sentence, the judge will build in a condition. For example, if it's a drug sentence and you complete the focus program, which is the drug treatment program in the prison, we'll take 1 year off your minimum. A lot of times they build it in. So there are incentives built in. There's already a mechanism to reduce your sentence. There's also the opportunity, the judge can authorize the opportunity for earned time credit. Now, this started out to be a short list approved by the legislature. If you got your high school diploma, you could get a certain amount off, and then it increased up to getting a college degree, you could get a significant amount. And then the legislature said, well, what about vocational programs, mental health programs, drug programs? All of those were specified by the legislature to be eligible to have your sentence reduced by a certain amount. More recently, the legislature said, well, stop coming back to us with this list of things. Let's leave it up to the commissioner to decide. If she thinks any program should be eligible to have their sentence reduced, we'll authorize her to do that. So when I was on the parole board, I was kind of surprised to see that there was earned time credit being given for programs that were completed on the tablet. This is during the COVID lockdown. They could complete a program on the tablet. It's a multiple choice. You watch a video, you take some questions. And inmates told me they could complete it in an afternoon, and they get 60 days off for that. So we've come a long way from you must serve your minimum imposed by the judge to having all these opportunities to reduce that actual amount. But all of these features that allow for a reduction of sentence have been authorized by the court. This bill would be the first one where you could be eligible for parole at less than your minimum without the court being involved at all. I think that that's a big mistake. If you want truth in sentencing to be real, it should be the sentence that is imposed by the judge is the sentence that's served. Now, the judge can change it. That wouldn't offend me. But this would be the first time that the sentence would be modified without the involvement of the church. It's the church, the court. It's Holy Week is fresh in my mind. So one of the things about going back to the sentencing judges, presumably they've heard all the evidence, they've heard from the victims, they've heard from the prosecutions, and it's been pointed out that a lot of these are negotiated pleas. Well, in a negotiated plea, a lot of times people will settle for a lesser sentence in exchange for a plea. So, for example, it's not unusual for a rape case to be pled down to a second-degree assault. So they don't have to register as a sex offender, but they'll agree to serve more time. So while this bill excludes sex offenses from being eligible for this 65%, in a negotiated plea, I mean, it might be, they would be eligible under a second-degree assault under this bill, but not for the real crime, that the underlying rape, which was pled down. So a negotiated plea, it's, I don't think it meets the spirit of the law. I don't think it's fair. It's not fair to victims. Having over the years seen many victims come in, every time there is a parole hearing or some change in the inmate's sentence, they notify the victim, and the victim comes in, and for the victim, they go right back to the day of the crime, even if it was 10 years ago. They're traumatized all over again. And so if you allow this at 65%, and then again at 66 2/3%, you're going to be re-traumatizing the victims. The victim at the time of the sentencing was consulted and knew what the sentence was going to be. This would change that, and they might be surprised. What do you mean they're getting out? So consider the concerns of the victims. The other concern I have is that this is the beginning of a slippery slope. Truth in sentencing has been gradually modified over the years with all these different provisions that have been added on. And the sponsor said that the bill is being applied prospectively, but if you look at the language, it says the provisions of this act shall apply to any person incarcerated on or after the effective date. Well, if you're incarcerated on the effective date, which is next January, that's everybody in the prison. That's a lot of people. I think they mean every person sentenced on or after the effective date. That would be a much smaller number. I mean, if it applied to everybody who was in the prison on or after the effective date who met these criteria, it would be a big burden on the parole board. And I think what they mean is somebody who's sentenced after that. Now, the slippery slope concern that I have is that there's plenty of time between the effective date of this and the first time anybody would be eligible. It would be like 2028 or 2029. In between, I would not be surprised to see the sponsors come back and say, well, maybe it's not 65%. They originally wanted 50%. And maybe the criteria are too high. It's really hard to have no major disciplinary violations in 7.5 years. Maybe they'd want to change. There are a lot of moving parts that could change between now and 2028. And I worry that by allowing this, you'll be going down that path. So I would ask you respectfully to find this bill inexpedient to legislate. And I will try to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much for your testimony this afternoon. Are there any questions from the committee? Seeing none,
Got off
thank you
easy.
very much.
Thank you.
The chair will call Miles Matson. Good afternoon, Mr. Matson.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee. My name is Miles Madison. I am the Chief of the Criminal Bureau here on behalf of the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice opposes this legislation. I'd like to speak to you about a few aspects of why the Department of Justice opposes this legislation. To begin with, this legislation proposes a duplicative mechanism. There are already mechanisms under current law to reduce sentences or options for defendants to reduce sentences. It also undermines the individualized sentence that a judge delivers as part of a plea or after a trial. Judges are considering the evidence, the circumstances that apply to that defendant in that particular case to arrive at that individualized sentence in the interests of justice. And it is also unfair to victims. As was mentioned previously, there's a carve-out and it treats victims of different ages differently as to the individuals who victimize them would be treated ineligible for an early parole. As part of the Department of Justice analysis, we start with what is the problem that this legislation is seeking to solve. would just note for the committee that the prison population has fallen by more than a third over the past 9 years. So New Hampshire is seeing a state prison population that is decreasing rather than increasing. There's also a rigorous and thorough sentencing system in New Hampshire. As I mentioned, it relies on the individualized determinations and individualized sentences that judges apply that are standard, well thought through, thorough principles for sentencing. Only a small percentage of defendants end up in state prison. It's for the most serious crimes, for those who commit multiple offenses, or those who have a longer criminal record. Going to the mention of this legislation being duplicative, I just wanted to reiterate and reinforce some of the prior testimony as to other avenues that defendants have for reducing sentences and why this mechanism is not necessary and inconsistent with the concepts in current law. First, a defendant may appeal a conviction and sentence to the New Hampshire Supreme Court. Second, there is the review of state prison sentences. That would be a panel of 3 Superior Court judges, which can take a look at the sentence handed down by a Superior Court judge. They can affirm that sentence, they can reduce that sentence, they can increase that sentence. I would point out that approximately 90% of those reviews result in affirming the original sentence. So that is a panel of 3 judges looking at that sentence and saying, this is appropriate for that defendant and that crime. There's also the sentence reduction, as was mentioned, that's RSA 651.20. That is when a defendant reaches 2/3 of the sentence. They can petition to go back to the original sentencing judge and request that the remainder of the sentence or some portion of that remaining sentence be suspended. Again, that would be going back to the judge that sentenced them or the original sentencing court, looking at that individualized case and making a determination about whether any of that sentence should be suspended. And then finally, the conflict with the parole system. So I'd note that there's a conceptual disconnect here. There are competing visions of the obligations of these 2 different entities. The courts, the judges who are sentencing, providing those individualized sentence, and then the statutory obligations and goal of the parole board. They are not the same. So a judge's sentence, which would be including mixed goals and trying to deliver what are the requirements of justice in this particular case. And the purpose of the parole and the parole board would be focusing on whether or not that individual is rehabilitated for reentry into society. Authorizing the parole board to move into the sentence that has been determined by a judge as an appropriate sentence for that defendant is changing the bar, it's changing the threshold, because the parole board's obligation, the parole board's mission is different than that of the original sentencing judge. So you're mixing concepts and mixing requirements by allowing the parole board to determine whether or not, according to a different standard, the individual before them should be paroled, when a judge has already determined that that minimum sentence is appropriate in the interests of justice. Would also note that under current law for parole, there are other options for reducing that minimum sentence, as was mentioned previously, the programming available under 651A22A, which can reduce a defendant's prison sentence by up to 21 months by participating in programming, positive programming. And then there's also the credits for good conduct, and that would go to consideration of the defendant's disciplinary record in prison. So turning to how this is unfair to victims, as was mentioned previously, it creates a disconnect between victims that are under the age of 18 and victims that are over the age of 18. So it would be saying that an individual who is 18, who is subject to a serious crime, is not treated the same as someone who may be a year younger. That's a disconnect that is unfair to those victims based on that category of age. The Department of Justice, in looking at this, if this body is to proceed with this legislation, would recommend eliminating that age exclusion, not categorizing victims merely based on the victim's age for the purposes of parole, and then would also recommend including or expanding the list of excluded crimes to include other crimes such as second-degree assault, arson, major drug dealing crimes, deaths resulting from dealing, and other major theft and fraud cases. However, I would note that the Department of Justice does oppose this legislation. I'd be happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you very much for your testimony this afternoon. Are there any questions for this witness? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
The chair will call Jay McKay.
Afternoon, I do have something. Good afternoon, Madam Chairman, committee members. My name is Jay Mackey. I'm the Director of Operations for the New Hampshire Adult Parole Board. Testifying in opposition to HB 588. Speaker Sytek and the previous speaker had touched upon a lot of the same issues that I was going to speak about, so I'll maybe piggyback with a little bit more on some of that, but won't go too in depth into what they've already spoken about. So when this bill was brought forth in the House earlier this year, one of the reasons spoken about getting rid of truth in sentencing was mass incarceration. New Hampshire does not have a mass incarceration problem, as there spoke about earlier, but we have about 650 less inmates than we did 5 years ago. Only about 2/3 of our community corrections beds are actually filled at this point because there's not enough inmates to fill them completely. So it's definitely, New Hampshire has already been trending towards a lot less of incarcerated individuals over the past several years. They spoke about the opportunities for sentence reduction with earned time credit through the programs that you can complete. Just to give some numbers on that, which is in this written testimony as well. In 2020, only 274 inmates received earned time credit. After the New Hampshire DOC made several changes, in 2021, 1,412 inmates received earned time credit. And then in 2022, that number dropped to about 790, most likely because of the less amount of inmates we actually had in the prison, which is still a 200% increase in the amount of earned time credit approved applications. There's a lot more programming available, as Speaker Sytek mentioned, through the tablets that came out during COVID, which was completely understandable as a lot of programming was shut down. The commissioner has done a pretty good job of trying to monitor the manipulation of these programs, which also might be a reason why there was less in 2022 than in 2021. But there's still a significant increase in the amount of programming that is allowing these inmates to get a reduction in their sentences. Previous speaker spoke about RSA 65120 with 2/3 that inmates allowed to apply for with the courts. And with that being the judges, the prosecution, the victims all having input in the sentences, they also have input in the decision when an inmate is looking for their 2/3. That RSA was amended 2 years ago, I believe, to be the inmate could apply for that 12 months before their 2/3 date, which would allow them to have their minimum suspended for that 2/3 time about 12 months ahead of time and allow them to work through the system to reintegrate back into society. Whereas if you need to be about 2 years from your minimum parole date before you can start going into minimum security and start getting jobs around the prison, around the grounds of the prison, and then working your way out into a halfway house where you could be having a job inside the community. All this for people that have been serving sentences 5, 6, 7, 10 years is vital to their success in the community, this reintegration process through community corrections. Division of Rehabilitation Services is what it's been renamed. What this does is it removes, this bill allows these people to apply for a parole hearing, taking the judicial process out of that entire process, which it kind of shows a lack of support or lack of faith in the actual judicial process. Whereas there is already a mechanism in place for these individuals to apply for this relief, which involves, as has been spoken to before, all the people that are involved in creating that sentence in the first place. Whereas if it's, you leave it up to the parole board to decide, and I've been working for the parole board for a couple of years now, and every decision that is made is very well thought out. It's researched to ensure that this person's going to be a good member of society. But you're also this would allow the parole board to cut someone's sentence by a third for people such as a professor, retired surgeon, and a former captain of corrections, as opposed to anyone that was actually involved in the sentencing process. So understanding the makeup of the parole board and as the previous speaker said, that's putting a lot onto people that don't have the experience in that area. Let's see. As was spoken to before, a 7.5-year minimum sentences these days is pretty much almost all violent offenses. These days, you're not seeing many people with that length of incarceration that is not a violent offense, except for your drug enterprise leaders or serious fraud convictions, embezzling, and major financial stuff. Problem I see in the future is these inmates that are going to be excluded is like they're going to be petitioning like what's the next step? So where do we stop? Because in 5 years, when we start having these parole hearings, and with all the criteria that is required of these people, and only 5 people make it because of the stricter criteria than even the courts have, there's going to be changes made to this bill when you realize that the intent of the bill is not being carried out, basically because it's really not going to affect all that many people with the current structure of the bill. I believe everything else I was going to touch on was actually already spoken about, so I welcome any questions you may have.
Thank you very much for your testimony this afternoon. Are there any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
The chair will call Joseph Lacaze.
Thank you. Good afternoon, members of the committee. My name is Joseph Lacaze. I will be testifying in support of HB 588. I will also be representing the ACLU in strong support of this bill. We've heard a lot of opposition towards this bill today, and what I want to do is I want to first just bring us to the genesis of this bill, where the actual intent originated from, and then just walk us through a couple things here. So, truth in sentencing was a bill that was introduced to New Hampshire back in the 80s, and it was introduced to New Hampshire around the narrative of an individual who was released by the parole board into the community who went out and committed a heinous offense. That's what brought truth in sentencing to New Hampshire. The prison system was built in 1812, and from 1812 to 1980, there was only 287 people that were incarcerated. Truth in sentencing was brought about, and 10 years later, the prison population went from 287 to 1,250. 10 years later, it was at 2,259, and in 2013, our prison system, going from 287 people pre-truth in sentencing, was at 2,700. So when we talk about the numbers are going down right now, we have not even hit anywhere close to pre-truth in sentencing numbers in the state. And the individual who the narrative was formed around that brought truth in sentencing to New Hampshire would not be eligible under this bill. On line 4, page 1, line 4, the 65%, this was originally it was 50%. Where individuals would be allowed, and there was concessions that were made to give people time to do the programs that they needed. Across the United States, there has been full repeals of truth in sentencing, and New Hampshire, I stress, took the most extreme version of truth in sentencing when we took 100% minimum. States were incentivized by the federal government for grants to lock people up for longer times. That's what truth in sentencing was, and that's why we had a 100% increase in New Hampshire. So going to compromise at 65% was something that all stakeholders at the table agreed to. Line 6, 7.5 years. The person was sentenced to a minimum of not less than 7.5 years. Currently standing right now, the average time that an individual gets incarcerated at the DOC is 3.5 years. So by putting this minimum to 7.5 years, while the bill was originally at 50%, it's still guaranteed that prison sentences were falling in line with what the current standard is in New Hampshire. On line 7, a person has no major A-level disciplinary violation. An A-level offense is things like attempted escape, assault on an officer, rape, things of that nature. That would be excluded from being able to apply under this bill. The person has not demonstrated a repeated disciplinary offense that results in an upgrade in classification level. Repeated pattern. The intent of this bill is to modify behavior. New Hampshire does not have any behavioral modification incentives at the DOC currently. We've heard about earned time credit, we've heard about 65120s, but none of those require an individual from the moment they wake up until the moment they go to bed to choose how they're going to behave. That is what's going to bring about the true goal of the incarceration system, which is to have less victims. A person, 95% of the people, I'm not 95, now it's down to 93. 93% of people who are incarcerated are going to return back to the community. So if they're going to return back to the community, we want to make sure that they have the right behavior so that they're coming back and they're not re-victimizing people and that they're engaging society the way that they need to be. And this bill does that. We've looked at line 14, subsection A, the person receives a sentence that prohibits him or her from being paroled. This was to make sure that there was no ambiguity around who would be allowed out. The person who has an offense like, first capital murder, first degree, anything that prevents a person by law, they would not be able to apply, and that was added in there to take that into consideration. Truth in sentencing is not really truth in sentencing. You are not sentenced to the minimum sentence because 150 extra days are added to your sentence when you are sentenced, which means that at any point in time, you could theoretically have more time added to your minimum based on your behavior than when you were originally sentenced. So I think that is a conflict in saying that it is truth in sentencing being that. One of the other concerns I wanted to bring up is the earned time credit. The earned time credit, we heard that there's many opportunities and avenues that people can use in the DOC. When I was incarcerated in the DOC, I don't have children, so I could not apply for the Family Connection Center earned time credit. I already had my high school diploma, so I could not go utilize the Granite State High School education system to get any of the earned time credit through them. Mental health said I did not have any mental health conditions that allowed me to take any of those classes. The only way that I could earn time was taking college courses, which I had to pay for. So I bought my earned time. That's not behaviorally modifying. That's having means. And there are other individuals that fall into that same boat. The earned time credit is a good system, but it does exclude people like me from it. And when I'm putting myself out here talking about this, one of the things that I do want to also say is we heard, well, the type of people who would be eligible under this bill, I'm one of them. I'm one of the people who would be eligible under this bill. I did do offenses when I was younger, but I learned while I was there. I changed my life. I decided what I was going to do when I came out. And I don't think that there's anyone who would say that I shouldn't be out here right now. And there's other people who would meet these criteria. These criteria are stricter than the current parole standards. People can parole with an A-level offense as long as they don't have one within 90 days. This is saying you can't have one your entire bid. You can't fake that. You can't fake that. This truly is a behavior modification. Some of the concerns regarding the court system. The first year that this was brought up, there was no opposition from the Department of Justice. It was more of an interpretation, not taking a position. This is the first year that there's been a position taken. And last year, one of the things that came up was how judges might modify their sentences based on this happening. What I wanted to say is that we do not live in the Minority Report type environment where people are getting sentenced for futuristic things that they may do. No, they are sentenced for the facts of what they've done. And if a judge was to change their behavior based on what someone possibly could do in the future, we are hinting at judicial indiscretion. And I don't think that any judges in New Hampshire at all would cross that line. This bill, what this does, there would be zero impact to anyone that's currently incarcerated, which means that moving forward, all judges would be aware that this provision was in place and still would sentence people accordingly. And when going back to the front page, the 7.5 years, you can have consecutive sentences for smaller level offenses, like sentences like 3.5 consecutive sentences, and still end up to that same. That doesn't mean that you had to do something drastic to get a 7.5 years. And a judge would still be able to take that into consideration when they were sentencing an individual to the DOC. Also, victim advocates brought up a legitimate concern that I'm partial to, which is the re-victimization that happens when they have to be brought back into these cases. And so thinking about that, that's why the retroactive portion of this bill was removed, and this is only prospective. In closing, I just want to say, I find it very concerning when we're talking about parole board members not having the expertise or the experience to decide if individuals who would be meeting stricter standards than the current ones should be allowed to parole. The purpose of the parole board is to deem people fit to come back to the community. That is why they are not held liable when anyone reoffends, because that is not on them. So I think that we need to really look at this bill, see how the impact that this can have, and pass this. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony this afternoon. Are there any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you very much. The chair will call Aubrey Friedman.
Madam Chair, committee members, Aubrey Friedman, Bridgewater, I speak in support of this bill. I testified for it in the House committee. I see they've changed it a little bit, made it a little tougher from going up from 50% to 65%. It's still moving in the right direction, so I support it. This would really affect per the fiscal note in the original bill, it said it would affect very few inmates. So we're not talking about a lot of people to begin with. And as has been mentioned before, the threshold for even being able to apply under the terms of this bill for parole are pretty tough. So I don't think you're going to get very many people that would even be able to apply for it. And I also think, why should somebody, if people do change, I mean, give them a second chance and they have to show it. And plus, I like the idea of actually having the parole board. People have said, well, the judge looked at everything at that moment and made probably the right decision. Well, several years later, 3 people looking at it might decide that things look a little bit different and have a different outlook. So it doesn't mean that the judge didn't look at it correctly at that time, but things change. And I actually like the idea of 3 people looking at it rather than 1. And especially years later, things have changed. So I say give the person who's met the conditions, give them a second chance to get out of prison earlier and start your life all over. And what's the advantage to sitting in prison for years at a cost to the taxpayers, mind you? The difference between incarcerated and parole is $63,545 per year per inmate. So it's a nice little savings for the taxpayer, but also for the person. I mean, they could actually get out and be a productive member of society, maybe take care of their family that doesn't have to be on welfare or something like that. So I say give them a chance. The one thing I do disagree with in this bill, and it's already been mentioned, paragraph 10, section C, that part about the 18 years old of age. Let me just read it here. Okay. So this would exclude it. The person was convicted of committing a violent crime as defined in RSA 651.5, and those are those violent ones, first degree, let's see, capital murder, kidnapping, so these are pretty serious crimes. against a person under 18 years of age. Well, that's silly. If you've done this kind of heinous, bad crime, then what's the difference on their age? So I really think that against a person under 18 years of age, those words should be removed. It just doesn't make sense to me. Otherwise, I think it's a good bill. I say give somebody, the few people that could meet this hard threshold, again, it's just the chance to apply for parole. Doesn't mean you're going to get it. And that's it. So I'm supportive of the bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Are there any questions from the committee? Okay, seeing none,
Thank
thank
you.
you very much. Are there any other members of the public that would like to speak to House Bill 588? Okay, seeing none, we'll close the public hearing. Thank you, Vicki. Thank you. Oh, geez, Louise, okay. Terry, oh, goodness. Okay. All right. Okay. Yeah, there's a lot of reps. It's like. Yeah. Let me know when you're ready, Matthew. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and open the public hearing on House Bill 624 and recognize the prime sponsor, Representative Siebert.
Thank you so much for hearing me today. I brought one of my co-sponsors up with me because due to allergies, my voice is going really
Okay,
fast.
you're-
So I was going to spare everyone.
Okay, who is the,
My name's Representative Jody Newell. I'm
Yeah,
a co-sponsor
Jody
on the bill. She just asked me to speak because she's not feeling well. So.
okay, hold on, let me
Speaking
find
of
you. Jody
Yes.
Newell, okay. I just want to make sure, when you speak that, because we want to attribute the correct words to the person, just please identify yourself for the record so our committee secretary can catch that appropriately. Thank you.
Okay.
Please continue.
Sure. This bill is fairly simple. It's very basic in what I consider to be common courtesy. We have an existing structure, a procedure for when there are going to be sobriety checkpoints. We have a notification regime for the police to notify the public. It's very broad. There are a variety of ways in which they can do that. What we're asking for is for them to apply the same procedure to immigration checkpoints. This would be Border Patrol performing immigration checkpoints anywhere 100 miles from the border, which encompasses pretty much all of New Hampshire. So we would like for this to be in place so that the citizens of New Hampshire, as well as visitors to our state, are notified properly in the event that they may be stopped arbitrarily. So especially because a lot of the times when they do this, you know, they're trying to cast a wide net. So they do this when there's going to be a lot of traffic coming up, and they'll essentially shut down a highway in order to do this. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Representative Siebert, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
I think she summed it up well. Yeah. Just ask for your support on this bill.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions? Okay, seeing none, thank you both for coming forward today. Okay, we've got a few representatives here. We'll call Representative Maria Perez. Good afternoon, Representative.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is the State Representative Maria Perez, and I represent District 43 in Milford. I'm here in support of this bill. For the reason is, for many contractors in our state, they don't know where they're going to be working in a specific day, and this can be affecting a lot of their projects that we have at the northern border, close to the northern border. One of them is my husband. He's an electrical contractor. He doesn't know where he's going to be every day. He can be close to the New Hampshire border. He can be in Massachusetts. He can be in Maine. He can be in Vermont, anywhere. And he's not sure when he's driving if he's getting close to the border. For people like him, it's critical for pass this bill because they never know when they're getting close to the border. And this can make it very difficult for them because for them to carry it, especially people like my husband, he is a citizen, national citizen, but his skin color is darker than mine. And then we know that profiling happens a lot. When you see people who looks like me close to the border, it is critical for them to feel safe and comfortable when they go and do their job. We have many projects in our state that are happening right now, and we have people from Massachusetts and other states that come in here to work. And for them to carry the U.S. passport or the citizenship is hard. If one of them loses their citizenship, they have to pay over $3,000 just to go back and then redo the citizenship paperwork, and it may take a couple of years before they can get it. And without the citizenship, they cannot get a new passport. They lose their passport, and both of them, it's hard to get one of those papers issued again. For that reason, I'm asking you to support this bill because we have a lot of companies already struggling to get workers here in the state, and then we have workers coming from another state, and they have to carry the paperwork just in order to be safe and feel safe close to the Canadian border. It's hard, but if we have this checkpoint and the police can put notifications, people can feel better to come in and work and feel like welcome and not feeling like threatened or feel like they never know when they can get arrested and they don't have the proper paperwork to prove that they are U.S. citizens or they have the right to be working in here. And for that reason, I'm supporting and I'm asking you to support this bill.
Thank you very much for your testimony, Representative. Are there any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you. The chair will call Representative Jonah Wheeler.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I come as a member of the Criminal Justice Committee who voted in favor of HB 624 in strong support of this. This legislation was sparked based off a discussion that started in large part because of a Supreme Court decision, Egbert v. Boole, in which the 100-mile Constitution light zone was discussed, in which they can consider any 100 miles from the border as the border. Because of New Hampshire's size, that encompasses all of New Hampshire and means that the federal government, if they wanted to do one of these immigration checkpoints, could do that throughout the state. I don't want to issue an opinion on the checkpoints. That's for the feds to have opinions about. But I would say, as Representative Newell and the representative before me, Representative Perez, talked about, it is more of a common courtesy than anything else. We give notice for the intoxicated driver checkpoints. We give notice for other checkpoints on our road. And when you're talking about shutting down the interstate, that's something in which I think we should be giving our citizens notice about before we move forward with that. So I don't have much else to say other than to help affirm the House's position of 220 to 152. the Criminal Justice Committee's position of 16-4, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not sure. Might have to correct me on that, but I believe it was 16-4. And just urge you to pass this bill so that we can give this common courtesy to the people. And I don't see Representative Roy in here, but if he was here, I would hope that he would tell his story, because he has a good example of his son was born in Germany. He was served our country and was stationed in Germany for a little bit. His son was born in Germany, and he doesn't have a passport. So if he was stopped in one of these checkpoints, he would have to go through some loopholes to be able to get through it. And I think that there are a lot of cases that's not just in regards to immigration or immigrant workers, but also people who are born outside of the country who may not have the passport or the ability to easily get that, as Representative Selig testified to on the House floor, who this is an impediment and a red line and a hoop they must jump through, which is not live free or die. And that's New Hampshire. So I thank you, Senator Carson, and take any questions if there are any, but that's my testimony.
Thank you very much, Representative Wheeler. Are there any questions from the committee?
Thank you.
Seeing none, thank you. The chair will call Representative Horrigan.
Written testimony, which I actually emailed to you, but I'll hand copies around. The trees have already been killed.
Representative, we've had quite a bit of testimony from other representatives on this bill. And we do have your written testimony. Can you quickly paraphrase your written testimony?
Yes,
We're
I
not
do.
executing this bill today, so we're all going to have time to read it.
Okay, yes, I mean,
Thank you.
I mean, personally, I sometimes find it useful to hear something as well as read it, but maybe that's just me. So I'm Representative Timothy Horrigan, represent Stratford County District 10, the towns of Durham, and I think it's useful. Two main reasons. One is it discourages the federal government from setting up such checkpoints in the event of an absence of a real emergency. And if there is, in fact, such an emergency, the bill does allow local authorities to wait for 24 hours before making an official announcement, or you could also like set up a roadblock for like some other reason if you felt the need to apprehend somebody who's coming down I-93. And secondly, it's useful to verify unofficial rumors or debunk false rumors. And of course, it's virtually impossible for these checkpoints to be set up without the cooperation of local law enforcement agencies. And certainly they would find out about it immediately if it did happen, and they would obviously want to send officers to the scene to help with traffic control. So as a practical matter, you probably can't have these just with federal law enforcement. So I think another problem is, the ostensible purpose is to stop terrorists, human traffickers, and drug dealers. But I think the data shows few have ever actually been caught. And the Woodstock location, which they like to use, is reasonably easy to detour around if you know the area. Even I myself, and live pretty far away. I know the side roads. So if I see more than once, if I've seen a checkpoint, if I'm heading north and I see a checkpoint on the southbound side of the road, we'll take some other route, back home, even one as simple as just taking the old Route 3 or whatever it's called through Lincoln and Woodstock. So it doesn't, so people of any knowledge of the area, including, and that would probably include, people, professional criminals who are trying to go through the area, but even law-abiding citizens, most part, know how to avoid these things. So you're just going to be, you're basically just apprehending a bunch of unwary tourists, basically. So, so I just think, I think these checkpoints are generally almost always pointless, just security theater, and on the occasions if there is a threat, they can still set them up. I really can't think of any major threats that have come to the northern border, except way back in 2001. Some of the 9/11 hijackers did cross over from Canada, but even in that case, they were not really the type of individuals that they'd be looking for. They were just ostensibly Arab college students anyway, so they probably wouldn't have been caught either. So, And then the other thing I'll say, like, this is a very popular bill. It passed the House easily, and also it's going to be part of the budget trailer bill too. So there's a lot of support from it in the House and hopefully a lot in the Senate too. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Representative. Are there any questions from the
All right,
committee?
thanks.
Seeing none, thank
Thanks.
you. The chair will call Frank Knack.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, thank you so much for the opportunity to testify. My name is Frank Knack. I'm the Policy Director with the ACLU of New Hampshire, here in strong support of HB 624. So as has been mentioned, this is very much just based on best practices around sobriety checkpoints. And in the handout I handed you, as an attachment, we included the Attorney General's New Hampshire Law Enforcement Manual, where in that manual, they note that sobriety checkpoints are important to, quote, to minimize motorist surprise, apprehension, and inconvenience. We think that same theory should be applied here in the context of, quote unquote, immigration checkpoints. I also think it's important to point out, because we've heard concern that this would be creating an additional burden or affirmative obligation on law enforcement to go out and find information. The bill is drafted very carefully to ensure that there is in fact no affirmative obligation. If law enforcement do find out about these happening from their federal contacts, then they are required to provide that notice. And in the bill, we make sure that they have a huge option of ways that they can do it. So they don't have to do A, B, and C. They can do A through or Z throughout whatever medium that they have. And I also really think it's important to kind of get back to what this is, our one of our main concerns with this, which is the rhetoric around this is it's been about immigration checkpoints. And so this is an issue we at the ACLU have worked on for a long time. And what we found and also what courts have found is that while these have been sold to the public as about immigration checkpoints, what they have really been, in fact, is a backdoor around the New Hampshire Constitution. And so fortunately, in New Hampshire, we value privacy and autonomy more than in other states. And so, for example, compared to Maine, we have much more robust search and seizure protections. And so, for example, under the federal Constitution, drug search dogs can be utilized without reasonable suspicion. Under the New Hampshire Constitution, that is not allowed, and that's exactly how we've gotten to this point. Law enforcement, the federal CBP have contacted local law enforcement, and how they've set these up are they contact local law enforcement, they say we're going to be doing this. When they do the drug searches with the dogs, which under the New Hampshire Constitution, they would not be allowed to do without reasonable suspicion. So the federal government will find drugs, and then they will literally hand them over to local law enforcement to prosecute under state law, which is an end run around our Constitution, something that New Hampshire courts have seen huge problems with. And so I just would really like to quote, not from the ACLU, but from a New Hampshire court in a case up in Plymouth, where they found, so this is not us speaking, it's the court. This court finds that while the stated purpose of the checkpoints in this matter was screened for immigration violations, the primary purpose of this action was the detection and seizure of drugs. And so again, these are a backdoor attempt around the Constitution, something that we're concerned about. And also we've heard that you need to have these opportunity to find quote unquote concealed humans. And again, in that same decision, they noted that a CBP officer had testified that he had never in his 17 years of service located a quote unquote concealed human in his practice. So again, we think this is a basic thing that New Hampshire should be doing to assert, our rights and to ensure that our Constitution is not being infringed upon. And Senator Abbott, you may recognize this is similar to the bill that passed out of your committee when you were heading it over on the other side. And so it's a bill that had, as I mentioned, broad support, and we hope that you all will support it as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Are there any questions from the committee? Seeing none. Thank you very much. The chair will call Sebastian Fuentes. Good afternoon, Mr. Fuentes.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the committee.
My name is Sebastian Fuentes. I'm the Movement Politics Director for Rights and Democracy in New Hampshire. But I'm here to talk to you as a resident of Thornton. I literally live about 4 miles from where these checkpoints happen, and I have been detained about 4 times already by Border Patrol. I go through I-93 to pick up my children from school, to do groceries, to go to work. Back then, I used to work at the Omni in Washington, so going I-93 was the only way that I can get to work. So I got stopped many times. They asked me if I'm a U.S. citizen. I comply. They still hold me up for a little bit of time, and then they let me go. On a second opportunity, I did not comply. They put me in a little detention area, and they told me to wait for an officer to come in and check me further. After a while, they came. They told me that I was good to go. The third instance, I was traveling with a friend, and she was the driver. We did not comply, and they took us to a little parking area on the side, and they told us to keep our windows up, to not go anywhere. We're not going anywhere. It was in the middle of summer. It was almost 80 degrees on the highway. I asked the officer to please let us pull the windows down because it was really hot in the vehicle. No, it couldn't happen. We were detained for almost an hour. Any further than that will be a big issue. This is a violation of our Fourth Amendment right. Border Patrol literally can set up a checkpoint outside Keene State University. They can do it at Dartmouth Medical. They can set up a checkpoint anywhere on the seacoast, which has happened. Many people always think about Thornton, Woodstock as the only place where they do checkpoints, but this happened also in the Claremont area. It has happened on the highway I-95, I think in the seacoast area. So it's something I think I'm here in support of this bill. So hopefully you guys can take a look at that. For 16 years of my life, I work in the hospitality industry. So many times I have guests and also coworkers calling me, asking me if those checkpoints were happening since I live so close to it. Because if that was the case, they would not be able to go to the North Country, even though they're U.S. citizens. They just didn't want their family to experience that situation, to having to report their citizenship, or just having to deal with that kind of situations with the loved ones. Law-abiding citizens, U.S. citizens born in this country, not legalized. So it's a matter of is strengthening the trust between local law enforcement and the community. And these checkpoints don't do that. So hopefully you take a look at this bill and support it. And that's pretty much all I have to say about this one. I'll take any questions if you have any.
Thank you very much for your testimony this afternoon. Are there any questions from the committee?
Thank you.
Senator Abbas has a question for you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for taking my question. You mentioned a few circumstances where you were detained. The decision for you to be detained, was that the local police or was that the federal agents?
Federal agents. Those are the ones handling the Border Patrol checkpoints. The local police is actually, they're usually at the exits of the highway. And when I got detained the second time, the Border Patrol officers told me if I move, if I don't comply with them, they will report to the local police that I'm obstructing traffic, even though they're the one that's stopping me. So they were at the exits waiting for backup, let's put it that way.
Okay, are there any further questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for your
Thank
testimony.
you so much.
Representative Garthright, you wanted to speak? Okay.
Thank you again, Madam Chair and committee. One of our criminal justice persons wanted to come and testify, but unfortunately she had a migraine, so she sent me this, and she wanted this to be her testimony. But I am Linda Harriet Gathright. I apologize, from Nashua, New Hampshire, Hills 10, Ward 9, and ranking member of the criminal justice. Okay. This is from Representative Salick, Lauren Salick, out of Durham, New Hampshire. And she says, I rise to support this bill to require notification by state police of immigration checkpoints. My father worked for USAID, I guess that is, and let me go back to it, and was stationed in Pakistan when I was born. Consequently, my first passport photos were taken when I was 10 hours old. I have been through an immigration checkpoint. They looked at my license. Then they asked me where I was born. Then they asked me for proof of citizenship, which I did not have on me, and directed me to the side of the road to answer more questions. After many more questions, I was released to continue on my journey. If I had known that I was driving in an area with an immigration checkpoint, I would have put my passport in the car that day and saved myself and the immigration officers a lot of time. This bill does not stop U.S. authorities from conducting these checkpoints. It simply requires state police to let the public know where they will be, just as they do with DUI checkpoints. And for people like me, it gives us an opportunity to decide whether to risk the extra delays and many questions, or whether to add an extra document into my car on a given day. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. I'm not going to ask if anybody has any questions. You're reading someone else's testimony. Thank you very much. Okay, are there any other members of the public that would like to speak to House Bill 624? Okay, before we close the hearing, I'm going to ask Mr. Lehman. Representative Wheeler had quoted a case, I believe it's Egbert versus Houle. I think that's correct. Boole, okay. If you can get that case for us and make sure that the committee members have it so we can have it in our bill files, that would be terrific. Seeing that there are no other members of the public that would wish to speak, we're going to close the public hearing on House Bill 624. Okay, thank you. Okay, Representative Roy is not here. Are you all set? Are you all set? Going to go ahead and open the public hearing on House Bill 596 and recognize prime sponsor, Representative Muse. Good afternoon, Representative.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the committee. This is a bill that is several years in the making. I think, as everybody on the committee knows, a few years ago, Governor Sununu appointed a commission on police accountability called the LEAC Commission. And while the LEAC Commission had some great recommendations, and I think some of them were some that my committee helped enact and your committee helped enact and that we as a legislature helped enact, one of the things that we did not get to was actually prohibiting racial profiling by law enforcement officers here in New Hampshire. This is something since the time of the LEAC Commission. I think we're up to well over 30 other states have passed a law like this. And one of the things I wanted to point out also is that New Hampshire has passed a profiling law. In the last session of the legislature, we passed and the governor signed a law banning motorcycle profiling. So we have the unique status of being the only state in the country that has banned motorcycle profiling, but has not banned racial profiling. What this bill would do is change that. It would set a firm policy statement that law enforcement officers in New Hampshire are prohibited from racial profiling. The bill also defines profiling, what constitutes profiling. One of the things you'll notice is that the bill does not contain penalties, and that was intentional. Part of the intent was to make the bill a little bit easier to pass. But the other part of that is the Police Standards and Training Council. If there are cases of racial profiling that are provable, those are cases that can actually be brought to the Police Standards and Training Council. And there's a disciplinary process that they can bring into play that would adjudicate those proceedings. So, and one of the other things that I also wanted to point out is there has been some confusion over time about exactly what federal law does and doesn't say about racial profiling. So one of the things that came out in some of the arguments against it on the floor was that Section 242, Title 18 of U.S. Code actually makes it a crime for any person acting under the color of the law to willfully deprive a person of a right or privilege protected by the Constitution or laws of the United States. So the way I think some people were reading that is they were saying, well, gee, you know, if you read that, that would seem to ban racial profiling. What you are not seeing in there is the standard that requires that the action on the part of the officer be willful, which is an extremely difficult thing to prove, which is one of the reasons why U.S. civil rights, this particular U.S. civil rights law, is fairly rarely applied. So we've seen it applied in the Rodney King case. We've seen it applied in the Mississippi burning case where the 3 civil rights workers were murdered back in the early 60s. We've seen it applied a few other times, but where it is definitely not applied is in cases in small states like New Hampshire where local and state police may or may not be racially profiling people. So I did want to make sure that that you understood that point as we go into that. And the only other thing that I wanted to make you aware of is that in committee, we did amend the bill 20-0. And one of the things that we did in the amendment was we removed the second part of the bill, which dealt with data gathering for sentencing disparity in New Hampshire. And one of the reasons we did that was because based on the testimony by state police and Department of Corrections, arriving at an exact methodology for making that happen and funding it and the implications on the county level, it was just a little bit deeper, I think, than we were prepared to go into. And I think what we wanted to do was to make sure that we didn't let maybe the great get in the way of the good. So we decided that that could be something that we could work on, continue to work on, and maybe submit in a different legislative session. But for now, our objective was to get a clean racial profiling bill through the House, which we've done, and to put it into your hands. And with that, I'll take any questions you have.
Thank you very much for your testimony, Representative. Are there any questions from the committee? Senator Abbas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you for taking my question. So I see on lines 5 to 7 is a degree, is a definition for profiling. Then if you go into the prohibited acts section, lines 14 to 15, it just forbids racial profiling only. I understand is the purposes only apply to racial profiling or to profiling on what looks like protected classes.
I think the way to read this is that one of the things we wanted to make sure of was that we had an explicit prohibition against racial profiling, and that's really what Section 1 does. We didn't want anyone reading this law to misinterpret it or to think in any way it was ambiguous when it comes to racial profiling. So I think that's one of the reasons why it's called out separately. If you look in Section 2, where we actually define profiling, it does extend to race, ethnicity, color, religion, nationality, and other characteristics as well.
Thank you.
Okay. Any further questions? Okay. Seeing none, thank you, Representative.
Thank you.
Okay, the chair will call Representative Linda Harriet Garthright.
Madam Chair,
Absolutely not. As long as you identify yourself for the record before you speak, we're good.
Again, I am Linda Harriet Gathright from Nashua, Hills 10, Ward 9. A little bit of background in regards to the racial profiling problem. Around the same time that the Supreme Court took up the question of pretext stops, state governments faced a public reckoning over their racial profiling practices. Although racially discriminatory policy practice have existed as long as the institution of policing itself, racial profiling as it is traditionally understood first gained widespread use by the Federal Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, during the Reagan era. In the 1980s, the DEA began creating profiles of typical drug carriers, which included race-neutral factors such as driving patterns or particular stopping points, but also listed characteristics such as race, age, and gender. These profiles were then disseminated to local law enforcement officers in training on drug interdiction best practices. Scholars and civil rights organizations began challenging the use of racial profile during routine traffic stops as a form of discrimination in the 1990s. After several high-profile incidents of police brutality drew broader attention to the issue. These challenges supported by studies at the local level demonstrating the inefficiency of racial profiling practices, resulting in the passage of legislation that banned the use of race in determining which individuals to subject to more intrusive police behavior. This legislative project, which began in the late 1990s, is ongoing today. Currently, existing bans come in assortments of structures. Some prohibit racial profiling, but omit any enforcement mechanism for officers who engage in prohibited behavior, while others merely impose data collection requirements. Some statutes, like Missouri's, impose consequences for noncompliance. Only 7 states both expressly prohibit the use of racial profiling in selecting individuals for enforcement and actually give a specific definition of what racial profiling is. These statutes consist of most or all of the following provisions: a definition of racial profiling that includes reliance on race, ethnicity, national origin, sexual orientation, gender, or religion in deciding whether to subject an individual to investigatory proceedings. A mandate requiring law enforcement agents in the state to draft a policy prohibiting such practices and outlining requirements for such policies. Officer training requirements and collection of data. I read that because some people believe that we don't have a problem in New Hampshire, but we truly, truly do. I came here in 1979 with my husband and 4 or 5 children. I currently have 13 grandchildren here now and 1 great-granddaughter, and have many friends across the state, not just in Nashua, very active in the community outside of Nashua as well. And the stories that I'm told are really horrifying. And nothing's worse than to have your children in a car and you stop for no reason at all. And you ask so many questions and you know that you have not done any wrong. You haven't spit, you haven't crossed over the white line, you haven't done any of those things. And how do you explain that? I find it very difficult every single time that one of my grandsons call me, mostly my grandsons call and say, Nan, this is just what happened. It really does something internal to them as well as me. And I think you'll hear from other facts that, my colleagues have. And we all live somewhere different. We don't live near one another and have the same type of experiences. So in my opinion, that's a bias. And that, how do you fix that? I would say education. is not something that I think is going to happen over time. Even if this law is passed, which I hope you do pass it, it still takes time, and it takes more than just this. And I remember when the LEAC Commission, and at the end of the day, when that was over, even the governor said, this is just one episode, basically, because there's so much more to come. And this is just a beginning, in my opinion. There's so much more to come after this in order for New Hampshire to address the issues of profiling, period. So that's what I have for now. And if you have any questions, please feel free.
I have one question. Representative, it's good to see you.
Great seeing you as well.
I certainly appreciate the premise of this bill. I guess my question is, how can we distinguish between racial profiling and using race as a description of a suspect?
I'll be honest with you. I was just in one of the paperwork that, and you probably have it because it was something that the immigration sent out, and they actually had a case here in New Hampshire where there were 3 young men arrested, and one of them was of color, and the other 2 were Caucasian, and the judge and the prosecutor gave jail time for the same offense. They gave more offenses to the black man, and the other 2 did not have jail time. It actually went to the Supreme Court here in New Hampshire, and that was adjudicated there because it was obvious what had actually happened with that young man, and that was here in New Hampshire. So before I leave, I will give you that information.
Well,
So, oh, you have it?
No, I don't have it, but I just want to add on to what, this is Jonah Wheeler from Peterborough, by the way. I think to answer your question, Senator Abbas, you would still be able to write down African-American male or Caucasian male, et cetera. The officer would still be able to write that down. I think like in the case that Representative Gothright just mentioned, if it's so egregious, that's what's under the ban. And I think, there's a lot of ambiguous cases, and a black person being arrested isn't in itself racial profiling. I think when it comes to these cases that Representative DiLorenzo has, that Representative Gothright has, and some of the other more egregious cases, it becomes a little clearer that there's a bias there. And in those cases, that's where that distinction can be made.
And if I may ask a follow-up, and I think the example you gave, it sounded like an egregious situation. I don't know all the facts of what you represented, but where the definition section says on line 5, shall mean the practice of relying to any degree. If we were to change it to say, rely solely on, as opposed to any degree, would that frustrate the intention of the bill? Or would that maybe solve the kind of question that I asked? And if you don't have the answer to that today, that's
Okay. Would you repeat that one more time, please?
if you look on page 5,
Okay.
line 5 on the first page, where the definition is, it says, in this chapter, profiling shall mean the practice of relying to any degree on race, and then it lists the categories. If you change to any degree to say solely on, would that frustrate the spirit of the bill?
No, I don't think so.
Because relying solely on is, I think that in and of itself should not be appropriate.
I'm okay with that. Yes.
I see.
No problem with it.
Thank you. Senator Whitley.
Thank you for taking my question. I mean, to that end, I think Senator Abbas raised the issue of, the issue of could this prevent stops when, we know there's a suspect with a certain description. But I think, wouldn't you agree that the definition that you have for profiling is pretty specific, right?
Yes.
And so that would address that situation anyway.
Absolutely. In no way would we be trying to hinder, they have a description of a person, they have it, and they should be doing their job, basically. We would not be trying to stop that. And I don't think the bill would try to stop that as well.
Thank you. Seeing no further questions, representatives, thank you for your testimony.
The one that I have here is incarceration, 2019, and it was, yeah, Mark Hayward, South Willow Street Justice Jail, the black guy, it says here. This was something in the Union Leader. Okay. But afterwards, you can just take a picture of it.
Good afternoon, Representative.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and honorable members of the committee. My name is Charlotte DiLorenzo, Representative Charlotte DiLorenzo, and I represent Newmarket. I brought some testimony here in support of HB 596. I stand in support of HB 596 as amended. As a Black woman, I believe that I was racially profiled by law enforcement in a New Hampshire town that I visited frequently to shop or do errands. One Saturday morning a couple of years ago, I was driving to Market Basket. On my way, I drove past the town police department building, and a few seconds later, I glanced in my rear view mirror and saw a town police cruiser flashing blue lights behind my car. I pulled to the side of the road to give the officer room to pass as required by New Hampshire law. As I came to a stop, I realized that it was me who was being pursued by the police officer. The officer approached my car. I handed them my license and registration. I did not ask why I was being stopped. I was scared, I was puzzled, and I was worried because I knew I'd done nothing wrong. I had driven at the posted speed limit. It was daytime. All of my required vehicle safety equipment was working properly. My driver's license and valid registration were valid. I was just someone's wife, mother, grandmother, going to pick up bread and milk on a beautiful spring morning. As I waited for the officer to approach my car, I recalled when years ago, my elder family member sat me down for the talk. The talk is a centuries-old legacy ritual passed down from our elders. The talk is about how to conduct ourselves if we are stopped by the police. Keep your hands visible, make no sudden movements, keep your mouth shut, be polite, and do not argue with the officer. The officer went to their cruiser to perform a record check on my license and registration. About 5 minutes later, the officer returned and told me that I was free to go. She explained that she was looking for a red Chrysler PT Cruiser. My car was a red Toyota Prius. The two cars did not look anything alike with the exception of being the color red. The officer did not apologize for stopping me. I was upset, angry, and humiliated. I was just minding my own business, and during those long moments, my whole view of the world had darkened. This type of racial profiling is also known as driving while black, or DWB. DWB happens to Black people and other people of color every day. That is why we still have the talk with our kids. That is the centuries-old legacy that we share with them. We fear for our safety in an unsafe world. I stand here today in support of HB 596, which if passed would prohibit law enforcement from racial profiling in New Hampshire. And I just want to say that this bill is not an anti-law enforcement bill. It's a bill about data. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Representative Wheeler, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I don't have a ton I'd like to add, Madam Chairwoman. I grew up in New Hampshire. I was born in Keene. My mother was white. I grew up to a white family. I actually didn't really get into Black culture until Linda here and our 4-hour-long conversations at midnight. But I definitely have gone through this, especially getting out and being a community organizer and getting out of Monadnock and coming into Manchester and Nashua. It's a lot more direct and impactful there. And it's definitely happened. I don't have nearly as impactful a story as them, but just hearing my brothers and sisters and siblings in the Black community tell their story about the discrimination that they faced and abject bias that they faced from people in positions of power, I think that it's clear to me that we need to pass this bill. I was in a car accident in January, and when the police officer came to write down the situation and finish up the situation with my car totaled on a tree right there, and I was sort of in shock. The first thing he says to me was, "You're going too fast, boy," and I was, no one would have faced that in a situation in which it was the middle of the winter, there was a snowstorm going on, and I slipped off the road going 20 miles an hour on 101. I was not going too fast. I do question, had I not been black and with dreads, whether or not he would have said that to me. And I think that there are a lot of cases that anyone who's a person of color in this state and across our country can claim to. And I think a messaging bill saying that the state does not support racial profiling in our institutions is a good thing. And I would support the changes that Senator Abbas has brought forward.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Are there any questions for the representatives from the committee? Seeing none, thank you all very much. The chair will call Jeffrey Odland. Good afternoon.
As president of that organization, I'm testifying briefly in support of this bill. I think that the senators, you've already heard, compelling stories from community members amongst your own ranks about the impact that racial profiling can have on our community. And so I would urge you to pass the bill as it is currently constituted, but also want to speak to the need for more information. New Hampshire is a state that I think is incredibly responsive to the people. It values limited government, and it values government oversight and transparency. And it's a cliche for a reason that sunlight is the best disinfectant. When you look at the structure of this bill, it's seeking to prevent racial profiling and racial disparities in two ways. It targets the initial contacts between our law enforcement officers and the citizenry. And it's also targeting the ultimate outcomes in our criminal justice system and whether there are disparities in sentencing. But there is one distinction in the bill that I think could be approved upon, which is that the bill makes it unlawful to sentence folks disparately based on race. And then it seeks to hold the state feet to the fire by capturing data about what the outcomes are. However, the bill also seeks, in a lot of the testimony you've heard, to curtail profiling in initial interactions between law enforcement, the sort of typical Terry investigative stop or traffic stop scenario. And I would encourage the committee to consider an amendment to add for the inclusion of capturing data on the part of the Department of Safety to find out whether there are disparate impacts on our communities of color for traffic stops and Terry stops. I personally didn't serve on the LEAC Commission. One of my colleagues at the law firm of Wadley, Starr & Peters, Donna Brown, did on behalf of the NHA CDL. And I know from speaking to folks that took part in that one of the big barriers to really knowing what the right next steps were was just the fact that we don't have the data. We don't know what the problems are, and we don't know how big they are. And a lot of these discussions about is there racial bias in the system, how often is it a problem, can become very emotional for folks. So I think it's paramount for everyone to have a clear policy discussion about this issue, that we have a better idea of what's going on here. The only way we can do that is to capture information about who are we stopping on our highways, and are they proportionate with the citizenry of New Hampshire? Are they proportionate to the racial and ethnic makeup of the folks that drive on our highways? Or is there something else going on here? The final thing that I would note for you all is just a note about how these things play out in the courtroom and the difficulties that occur if we don't have this data. if you are charged with anything from a criminal driving offense to even a traffic ticket potentially, you have a potential Fourth Amendment argument to say my rights were violated because I wasn't stopped by the police for some violation of law. I was stopped on the basis of racial animus or racial bias. But to make that showing is very difficult. The law of search and seizure, in particular the Wren case, Supreme Court case of Wren, says that it's perfectly fine for a police officer to stop you on a quote unquote pretextual basis. What does that mean? It means that if the police want to be really engaging in drug enforcement actions, they can enforce speeding violations. They can enforce whether you have an obstructed view because you have an air freshener hanging from your rear view mirror. And that is perfectly fine. One of the corollaries to that, unfortunately, is that when folks believe that they've been stopped merely because of their race, it's always quite easy for law enforcement to simply say, well, you were going 5 miles over, or you had the air freshener. There's a perfectly lawful reason to stop you. And the way courts have dealt with this typically is to say that a defendant can bring forward a claim of potential racial bias by pointing to statistics and data that might support that conclusion. So for example, if the data shows that 90% of the folks that are pulled over for having an air freshener on their rearview mirror are Black or Hispanic, there may be something going on there, right? And perhaps the data doesn't bear that out, so it's a strike against the criminal defendant. In the state of New Hampshire at this point, we don't have any way to bring those facts to bear before a court because we don't know what's going on. And so, again, I would say that New Hampshire has always valued government transparency. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. I think our community, through the commission, made a promise to the state at large that we would take these issues seriously, and we can only take them seriously if we know what's going on. So I'd ask you to pass the bill as currently presented and to consider an amendment to also capture data with respect to traffic stops and investigatory stops. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Are there any questions? Senator Abbas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for taking my question. The last witnesses that testified, I asked them about the language on line 5 of page 1, about instead of it to say to any degree, if you were to change that to say solely on, would you?
So my only concern, Senator, would be just that it's so hard to discern, what's in someone else's mind, that to raise the bar of saying that a law enforcement officer's reason for stopping an individual is solely based on race, I think makes it a nearly impossible burden. But another thing I would point out, Senator Abbas, as I was hearing your concerns during the earlier speakers, is that I think the language in Romans 3, which starts at line 22, addresses the concerns that you had raised earlier, which is that there may be legitimate law enforcement functions for one of the identifiers of a suspect, for example, being their race or ethnicity, and you don't want to tie law enforcement's hands behind their back, is what I took from your line of questioning. I think that the carve out that's sort of delineated in Romans 3 already accomplishes that. And so I would support keeping the language as it is in section 5, or line 5, I should say.
Are there any further questions? Seeing none, thank you.
Thank you, Senators.
The chair will call Joseph Lacasse.
Thank you, Madam Chair and committee. My name is Joseph Lacasse. I'm representing the ACLU of New Hampshire in strong support of this bill. We've heard a lot of testimony today, so I'm just going to keep mine brief. One of the first things I wanted to talk about about this bill is I served on the LEAC Commission, and this was something that there was unanimous agreement that came out of that we should be having this. And, really what I want to ask is if we can pass a bill on consent and voice vote to ban profiling of motorcycle clubs, why can we not pass a bill to ban the profiling of Asians, Hispanics, whites, blacks, and every other community member in the state? Like, why are we having any opposition to that? I don't understand. When we, to Senator Abbas's concern, how to distinguish between when a person is being targeted by race as opposed to you know, a description that came in. It's intent. It's intent. And as a lawyer yourself, I'm sure the standard that's used is reasonable and articulable suspicion. That's what we use. And if that can't be identified, then that's an issue. The only reason why I want to share this story is because you brought up the concern of solely. In 2020, I had purchased a Mercedes Benz, and I was leaving my work here, going to Manchester. I was followed for over a mile. I wasn't breaking the law. I hadn't done anything, and right as I was about to cross into the Manchester line, I was pulled over. I had seen the officer pull up behind me. I asked him why I'd been pulled over. He said I had swerved in the lane. I said I avoided the same pothole that you did. And he asked me, he said, did you travel this road yesterday? I said, no, I did not. I said, it must have been a different black person with the white Benz. And he said, yes, it must have been. That is relying solely on race, but that's not what was put into the report. You're never going to see a police report ever that says, I pulled this individual over because he was white. I pulled this individual over because of that. No, there's a description that comes in through evidence or through tips or something like that they can reasonably articulate that leads them to pursue the apprehension. So in closing, one of the last things I just want to say, when it comes to HB 596, if we can't, as a legislature, pass a bill that prohibits, as a statement, saying New Hampshire is taking a zero tolerance policy against racial profiling against all community members, if we can't pass that, I think that there's bigger issues than the concerns that have been raised on HB 596.
Okay, thank you very much for your testimony. Are there any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you very much. Are there any other members of the public that would like to speak to House Bill 596? Okay, seeing none, we're going to close the public hearing and the committee will be in recess for 15 minutes. What? No, we're going to do the two portions. That's it. Nope. That's it. So. And I think we already know where we are. So.
This is so funny. Like, my jacket is not that red and her jacket is not that pink. We're all very electric.
The blues. Okay. The committee will come out of recess. Can I get a motion to go into executive session?
So moved.
And moved by Senator Whitley, seconded by Senator Abbott. Okay, first bill we're going to take up is House Bill 88, and I'll recognize Senator Abbott for a motion.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move inexpedient to legislate.
Okay, we have a motion of ITL. Is there a second? Second. Okay. Are there any comments? Senator Whitley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think that an ITL is a mistake. I think that it is very clear based on what's happening around the country that it's important for New Hampshire law to be very clear about whether or not women and pregnant people have access to abortion up to 24 weeks. I think we debated this on the floor and it became pretty clear that, you know, the Fetal Protection Act specifically says that nothing in that law shall be construed as creating or recognizing a right to abortion. So, you know, at best, our law is silent on whether there is a right to abortion. And you know, at worst, it's very clear that there is no right. And so I think if we are, you know, going to listen to 70% of our constituents that are pro-choice, this is a pro-choice bill. And I think providing that clarification in law does not hurt anything. It only provides clarification as our citizens are looking around the country and seeing additional restrictions on abortion every single day. It was a particularly troubling week for abortion access when one federal judge in Texas ruled that mifepristone, that the FDA should not have approved mifepristone. This is really troubling times. Of course, New Hampshire residents are looking around the country at other states taking action, at federal judges taking action, and they are looking to us to specifically speak on whether New Hampshire citizens have the right to abortion. I think also it's really important that we look at what the court said in Dobbs. They were very clear that the issue of abortion, they specifically overturned Roe and saying that the issue of abortion is for legislative bodies, that they found no constitutional right to abortion in the federal constitution. And they specifically said that it should go back to the legislative process and for elected officials to make those decisions. So I think we need to act at the direction of what the Supreme Court said. And I think, this bill would do that. This bill does nothing to interrupt the work that was done related to the 24-week abortion ban. That's an issue that this committee worked at length on. This bill does nothing to interfere with that. It only codifies the right to abortion up to 24 weeks. And I think it would be, it's a real disservice to our residents if we ITL this bill.
Okay, are there any further comments? Senator Chandler?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will echo Senator Whitley's comments that I think that it is incredibly important that after having existing law for 60 plus years, to have, or not quite.
50 years.
50 plus years, that the existing law for 50 years has changed. And we at the state level absolutely need to address it. And we are not addressing it. As we recall, the Fetal Life Protection Act passed before the Dobbs decision was rendered. So we had that federal position prior to the Fetal Protection Act. Now we have that. Now things have changed. And by doing nothing, we are not rectifying the situation. I think that establishing HB 88 in our law would make it clear for women and people here that abortion access is legal and would be protected until a certain time.
Thank you, Senator. Are there any further questions or any further comments? Okay, seeing none, we have an ITL motion. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed?
No.
Okay, I will take this one out to the floor. Okay. Okay, next, the other one we have is House Bill 224, and I recognize Senator Abbas for a motion.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move in expedient to legislate.
Okay, is there a second? I'll second that. Okay. Okay, we have a motion of ITL. Is there any comment on this? Yeah. Senator Whitley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, I think this was a fairly straightforward bill. We heard really troubling testimony from our medical providers that the threat of criminal penalties not only interferes with their ability to give compassionate care and medically appropriate care, the threat of criminal penalties is interfering with that care. I think that's really problematic. We also heard that criminal penalties are potentially going to impact our ability to recruit OBGYNs to our state. We already have a maternal health crisis in New Hampshire. We have a provider system that is very, very fragile, and doing anything to jeopardize the provision of maternal health care, I think, is really troubling. And so this felt like a very important way to send a message to OBGYN students and prospective residents that New Hampshire is a place that values the practice of medicine. I think there are other ways to address provider compliance with our laws, with OPLC, the Board of Medicine. It's just not necessary. There's no other medical procedure where we impose criminal penalties on doctors. It feels political in nature and really unnecessary when it could be so detrimental to our maternal health system. I'll be voting against that too.
Thank you, Senator Chandler. Yeah, I think I kind of get it. So.
And thank you, Madam Chair. Medical professionals are held to a very high standard, and there are rules in place by which they must adhere to the standards that are in place. This bill goes many steps farther than it needs, this bill is necessary to remove the criminal and civil penalties that are in our current law. The unintended consequences of those penalties were enumerated for us during the public hearing, and I am certainly persuaded that we need this bill to protect folks in the medical professions when they are engaging in the practice of medicine.
Thank you, Senator. Are there any further comments on the bill?
Madam Chair, if I may.
Yes.
So I also want to point out that this is an area where the governor had indicated that he would potentially be supportive of. And so I think, it in response to that and the bipartisan vote in the House, I'm disappointed to see we can't get this done in this committee.
Thank you, Senator. Are there any further comments, questions? Okay. Seeing none, we have an ITO motion. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed?
No.
Okay. Senator Abbas, would you like to take this one up? Okay. Okay, can I get a motion to come out of executive session? Moved. Okay, moved and seconded, moved by Senator Whitley, seconded by Senator Ward. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay. We are out of executive session and we've completed our business for the day. Thank you very much.